There's the big three. Those would be the occupation zones. Poland would lose a big hunk of their land, but they get a big hunk of Germany. And all the people who lived there, the Poles, at gunpoint after the war. They'd be forced this way. All the Germans who lived here at gunpoint. This will go on for years afterwards. But at first, people thought, oh, you see the picture? They're like putting the puzzle of Europe back together. That's what they thought Yalta was. But more and more conservatives begin to equate Yalta with Munich. They gave in to Roosevelt, or I'm sorry, they gave in to Stalin. Roosevelt was fooled, or maybe even there were traitors with Roosevelt, betraying our enemy. And Munich and Yalta became combined. They talk about Yalta all the time. No, it wasn't like that. And there's something else. If the Soviets pledge they're going to have free elections in Eastern Europe and then don't do it, what is the United States going to do?
Nothing.
Do we want a war with the Soviet Union?
No.
Especially if there'll be free elections in Poland? So, but this cartoon shows Stalin taking everything from the US and Britain. That's the cartoon. This is a little kid. So, the next big conference would be in July after Germany surrendered. Potsdam, that's what's outside of Berlin. That's where the old Brandenburg and Prussian kings lived. The palace there is really cool. But they met at this hotel in Potsdam. It's in the Russian occupation zone. And you notice things are different now. Stalin's there, but now Truman and then Churchill came one day. They had an election, the first election since the war began in Britain. His party lost. Clement Attlee, the leader of the Labour Party, came back as prime minister. Now, it's not quite what you think. Truman, when he became president, he had no idea about anything. He was not informed about the Manhattan Project. He knew very little about Yalta. He'd only had 2 formal conversations with Roosevelt. That's it. So nobody was more surprised he was president than him. Attlee was part of Churchill's war cabinet. So he was part of the governing coalition government. And so, I'm just making sure the video is playing. Yeah. And so, you can imagine how Stalin.
Was Churchill there too?
No, Churchill went there for the first day.
Oh, okay.
And then, they had the first election since the war began. And Churchill's Conservative Party lost. And so, Attlee formed the new government. Attlee came back. And Churchill's out of government. He'd be back as prime minister again in 52. But you can imagine how Stalin felt. Who the heck is Truman? Who's Attlee? In fact, he came in as the victor. He strutted around, I defeated Germany. It's me. And Truman went in there already stinging from Americans making fun of him. The joke was, who's Truman? He was a relatively prominent senator, but nationally an unknown man who was forced upon Roosevelt by Southern Democrats. And when he became president, how do you replace Franklin Roosevelt? And so he's going to spend a lot of time proving that he deserves to be president, even though he didn't really want to be. But now he's president, he's going to do it. And he always had kind of an inferiority complex his whole life. That he always felt that people were making fun of him, and he always had to stand up to them. It probably stems from when he was a little boy. He had really bad eyes, and he had to get glasses. And the big thing about getting glasses as a little boy in the 1890s, they were incredibly expensive. Can't break them. So what could he do? He couldn't play, do the other stuff that all the other kids were doing. And that really affected him. So he always wanted to prove it. So he was a war, he was a captain of World War I. He did all these things, but he was always wanted to stand up to people. Always felt like they were making fun of him. So in fact, his diaries, he would write over and over again how he's going to he's not going to back down to Stalin. He's not going to let Stalin browbeat him. He's going to stand up. Makes a big deal about it. And you combine that with the events going on. Stalin promised things and then looked like he wasn't doing it. Who knows where they're going to stop? So at Potsdam, the first thing, the 4 powers would administer Germany. And someday they'll come together to unify. technically the four powers would administer the Germanies until 1991. They finally had their last meeting. When I was a kid, it'd be East and West Germany, but technically there was the four powers.
That's us.
Is that for me? Did you know it was you? You need to put down your drink like you do. Oh. Gotcha. They finally found you. Next. Even though Japan and Russia were still had a neutrality pact, US and Britain, so Truman and Attlee would issue the Potsdam Declaration. And basically told Japan you must unconditionally surrender. There's a couple caveats though, or face prompt and utter destruction. So the surrender would be destroyed. And the thing about the Potsdam Declaration is technically Stalin had nothing to do with it. Nobody knew, except for a tiny little group of people, that Stalin had promised to invade a month after this. So the Japanese thought that the Soviet Union was still neutral. Now remember this term utter destruction, because this is going to mean something when the Japanese get it. And then they waited for a response. Also, Stalin informed Attlee and Truman, you know that whole thing about free elections? Kidding. Nah. We're going to have Stalinist, communist governments, and I'm going to make sure that they're friendly governments. And the big one would be, Poland, but then Czechoslovakia finally 48 for sure. This is going to eventually be known as the Iron Curtain. He wanted to make sure he had a buffer zone between Germany and the Soviet Union. And Truman and Attlee informed Stalin, that whole thing about reparations? There's no money in Germany. Germany has been flattened by the war. There's nothing left. You can't get blood from a stone. You can't get money from Germany. Stalin didn't care. He saw this as proof that the Western Allies had just been using Soviet blood to defeat Germany. He was furious. So there's a lot of resentment right there. And when the whole thing ended, Truman was desperate to prove how tough he was. So near the end of the conference, Truman informed Stalin about an event that was codenamed Trinity. What's Trinity? Yes.
I just got an email about Trinity on from you releasing it on YouTube or something.
Yeah, I had a bomb about it. I wrote a video called There's a video called Trinity is the Atomic Bomb. Trinity is a code name for the first atomic bomb.
Wait, what? Say it again.
Trinity was the first test of the atomic bomb. We had two different atomic bombs the United States was building. We codenamed the first test Trinity. That's the first atomic bomb. And we had two different types of bomb. One we were sure would work. The other one we had to test. In fact, Roosevelt got the code, the baby is born. The bomb worked. And in glee, he went to Stalin. He went, that's a bomb. One bomb can destroy a city or a harbor. One bomb. And he wanted Stalin to be afraid. How did Stalin react? He's puffing on his pipe. Very close to that. He said, good, I believe you. Truman was so disappointed. He wanted Stalin to be afraid. Why was Stalin so nonchalant? He already knew. There were spies at Los Alamos where they designed the bomb. In fact, the plans for the Trinity bomb were already on the way to the Soviet Union. We knew that after the fact, obviously. We did not know that then. What happened was, you had all these scientists who were fleeing fascism. Like Enrico Fermi did the first nuclear chain reaction from Italy, and Leon Ziegfeld from Bulgaria. They went to England first, but Britain didn't have the resources. So they basically loaned them to the United States, with the idea they would work on the US bomb, then after the war, they'd come back to Britain and work on this. So a lot of the scientists are American physicists, but there are a lot of British or Enrico Fermi or others there. So that's Trinity, the first atomic bomb. I will show you the film of that on Trinity, the atomic bomb movie, in a second. So, while Potsdam is going on, and Truman is desperately trying to prove he's tough, In fact, he would say that we're gonna make the Soviets play ball. He kept saying that over and over again. The US was already bombing, called strategic bombing. Remember total war when you try to knock out the industry, knock out the transportation, knock out the oil? The US tried to do this in early 44. It failed miserably. They tried to do it from bases in China. It didn't work. But now they could use the Marianas, Guam, Tinian, Saipan. And they had a new plane built, a $2 billion project called the B-29 Superfortress. It could fly at over 25,000 feet, as high as 35,000 feet, so they thought it was above Japanese defenses. By the way, to get that high, it was pressurized. A big advancement. Because you get about 15,000 feet, if you're not pressurized, it's 50 below zero. How could you perform? Yeah. A pretty amazing plane. It could carry 10,000 to 20,000 pound bomb, depending on the size they would use. And they thought they could bomb specific Japanese targets from 30,000 feet, so bomb factories, harbors, that sort of thing. It failed miserably. They were not near as accurate as they thought. And the Japanese could get that high. Japanese fighter planes started shooting them down. That's a B-29 getting hit. See the wing right there, taken from another plane. And there's something else. When they were flying west, they ran into 120 to 140 mile per hour headwind. Now they knew there was headwinds up there at that high altitude, but this was a constant headwind. And sometimes it would use up all their fuel fighting that headwind and they'd have to turn around without bombing. They didn't know about this huge wind that goes around the world. The Japanese knew. They didn't know. The Americans, they discovered it, bombing, trying to bomb here. What wind goes around the world at 30,000 feet? The jet stream. Have you heard of the jet stream? So much dictates our weather. You got to look at the weather map, it has a little line there of the jet stream. They ran into the jet stream. They have no idea. So it was too costly to bomb. They ran out of fuel. They had to carry too small of bomb loads. The Japanese knew and were already bombing the United States using the jet stream. Anybody know how? They were using balloons. Yep. Balloons with incendiary or fire bombs that would float across the Pacific, and they thought these fire bombs, they'd release sandbags at on a timer, with the idea being to be somewhere over the Pacific Northwest. They would start a forest fire, and we'd have to send our troops back to fight the fire. I know, it's not, but that's what they thought. They did. These are all known places. What's amazing is how many hit Montana.
Didn't only one actually.
There was one in Oregon, yeah. They did cause some fires, but it didn't happen the way they thought. But it's still actually pretty remarkable. So Montana was hit by Japanese attacks. My wife's grandfather found one, it's right about here. He was one who found it a few years after the war. He was hunting near Phillipsburg. They're from Phillipsburg. Tramping through the mountains and found the remnants of one.
So it was a Japanese.
Yeah, Japanese attack. So the US had to switch tactics. The jet stream and all these other issues. And what they brought in was they switched to firebomb. A very experienced and hard-nosed commander from Europe came over, Curtis LeMay. That's him in Time magazine. And that's his success in Europe, leading bombers there. And he switched tactics to do what they were already firebombing against Germany. Remember I told you about how the British firebombed Hamburg back in 43 and killed 40,000 people in one night? Well, going into 45, the Allies, starting with the British, but the Americans too, started firebombing every German city, desperately trying to kill as many civilians as possible to force them to surrender. In one town in Dresden, over 1,000 British, then American planes, and then British at night, Americans in the day, firebombed Dresden. And we don't know exactly how many people killed, because it was kind of a refugee center. So you had all these Germans who were fleeing the Soviet advance there. When it finally became, the British finally acknowledged they did it in the 1960s, but it was always said about 120,000 people died that night. That appears to be a somewhat of an exaggeration, but it was still probably over 70,000. Dresden, this beautiful Baroque architecture town, was destroyed. Yes?
What did the U.S. do that they bombed?
Firefighters. Kill the firefighters. They can't put out the fire. Total war. Dresden would happen to be in the Soviet zone, and part of it was as a little message to the Soviets. You might have this powerful army, but look what our Air Force can do. Don't forget that. There was always an element. I was in Dresden in 2006, and when it's part of East Germany, they do a lot of rebuilding of this beautiful town, and so they're trying to rebuild it. So in 2006, the whole town, about 400,000 people, it's a big construction zone. And I guess it's beautiful now. I really want to go back. Hint, I said bride. Yeah.
All expenses paid.
I went first class too, right? I mean, come on. There's a level line. So those are fireballs. White phosphorus, which will ignite with oxygen and will not burn until it runs out of fuel. So if you throw water on white phosphorus, what does it do? Burns more intense. And a new incendiary that the US experimented with in Europe called napalm, which is jellied gasoline. And they begin to drop these weapons and only one target. Kill as many civilians as possible. They're going to now fly 12,000 feet at night. They got rid of most of their defensive weapons so they could come low under the jet stream and kill as many as possible. Now this, by the end of the war, they started doing it daytime too. In fact, this is going to be over 500 plane raid. A massive attack on Tokyo on the 9th and 10th of March, 1945. And this would trigger an unbelievable firestorm. There had been a firestorm in Hamburg, Dresden, a smaller one in Berlin, yes. Napalm and white phosphorus, both of them. They used really heavy bombs they called cookies. And the thought was that would make a lot of like rubble and then the fire bombs. And a lot of the Japanese buildings, especially south from Tokyo on south, the walls are wax paper. Can you imagine what that's going to do? And so this was to kill as many people as possible. So that's what it looked like from the air during the bombing at night. That's after it. Over 100,000 people died that night. LeMay would be promoted. Do you know what a firestorm is?
Next one, the fire creates its own weather.
So you think about fire, sucking in oxygen. This fire needs oxygen. As it gets bigger and bigger, it sucks in more oxygen and kind of implodes on itself, getting hotter and hotter, over 1,000-degree fire. And as it sucks in air, soon the winds will be over 100 miles per hour. It just sucks everything in, gets hotter and hotter until it literally runs out of fuel. This firestorm would be the big killer. Not only would it burn and horrifically injure people, but think about those who went to bomb shelters. It's going to suck all the air out and asphyxiate thousands.
How many people died?
Over 100,000. And that's the big killer. In atomic bombs, it's not the radiation that's the big killer. Don't get me wrong, the radiation, what's called fallout, which is an after effect of this, are big, but it's the fire that's the killer. Fire is the big killer. So an atomic bomb creates a firestorm. The big difference is that took thousands of incendiary bombs. The atomic bomb, one bomb. That's one bomb. And so with that, they ran out of bombs. As soon as they got more bombs, they bombed more cities. So by June, they would literally be bombing every Japanese city till they'd run out of fire bombs and wait till more. This map shows, that's Tokyo after the war. 40% gone. I don't mean bombed, I mean gone by fire bombs. That's right after the attack. So that's rubble. So this map shows that these are all Japanese cities. And they have the percentage destroyed by fire bombs in World War II, and they have an equivalent size American town. So 40% of Tokyo gone, that's equivalent of New York City. Just think about a town of 7 million. 40% gone. And so massive cities like Osaka, which is the size of Chicago, 35% gone. Toyama, which is the size of Chattanooga, is 99.5% gone. And on. They go through every city. And so people hear about the atomic bomb, and that was a bomb. No. We're killing tens of thousands of people every night. The only reason they didn't bomb more is because they literally didn't have enough fire bombs. They had to wait for more.
Is there anything on there that says 100% gone?
No, Toyoma's the biggest. I mean, the worst. And so that is every city, except for one. They didn't bomb one big city with fire bombs. Hiroshima. So you can imagine a lot of refugees would go there.
Oh, that is-
So they did this all through the summer. So you think about the atomic bombs, the bomb on Hiroshima is on the 6th, on Nagasaki the 9th. It's not like they quit bombing and just sit back. Or there's no, they were still bombing that day. They bombed that night. They bombed the days between. They bombed other cities with fire bombs when they attacked Nagasaki. And they kept firebombing. In fact, the last firebombing raid was on its way to Tokyo when they heard the Japanese finally did it, or agreed to the armistice. They were literally within sight of Mount Fuji. So it's not like they didn't bomb other things. You know, people say, oh, we did the atomic bomb. No. It was one part of many. But by the way, doesn't it have a big impact on the decision making? Think about it for a second. Just think about it. We'll come back to that. So let's get back to this then. You combine that with the submarine blockade. Submarines at first here and then right off the shore of Japan, they cut off by August. Japan only had 3 months of effective oil reserves and 6 months of effective food reserves. They could, and they were already on absolute crash rations. You know how much a civilian, you know how much their rations were by August? How many calories?
It's about 100.
No, not more than that, but it was about 550. Which is, you know, a Kit Kat. And so,
Actually, that's about 2.5 pieces of little Caesars pizza a day.
it's, so the point is they're nearly none. People don't talk about the submarines as much because it's not as glamorous as aircraft carriers and things like that. But this was the most effective blockade in history. The US submarines. They did basically destroy the entire Japanese merchant fleet. And so they are near the end. And so by that summer of 45, Truman has, well, the United States has a lot of planning, or a lot of questions here. How do we get out of this thing? We want out. Now, Japan was already sending peace fillers. That's Tokyo, by the way, after the firebombing. The Japanese had already sent peace fillers, ironically, to the Soviet Union because they thought the Soviets was neutral. To Switzerland, too. And they said, okay, we need out of this war, but to avoid total humiliation, remember Bushido. Do you remember that? The emperor. We want to keep our emperor so we can save face that way. So there can still be the remnants of the Japanese empire. It'll be humiliating, but maybe the army will accept that. But here's the deal. The Potsdam Declaration came. So the Japanese did one of these. They responded with, we will not respond until you alter it. But the US mistranslated that into, we are ignoring the Potsdam Declaration. And so the US thought they just ignored it out of spite. When it's more like the Japanese are saying, okay, we're opening the door, let's see where you're going. This is one thing the language had. Because it was one of those things where words have two meanings. Yeah. And if you don't really understand the meaning. And the other thing is this, and don't forget, we're stuck with this unconditional surrender. How do we quit? And think about Truman. He's sitting there going, God, I can't let down the legacy of FDR. And what are people going to think about me if I now all of a sudden make terms with Japan? Especially a guy by the name of Stalin. He might try to keep pushing me around after the war. I'm not going to allow that. Then, let's say we want to end the war, or we wait 3 months till they run out of oil. That might mean another 9,700 Americans killed in action. This was an estimation by the War Department, Pre-Defense Department. Can you imagine going back to the American people saying, yeah, let the war go on for another month or 3 months and your son was killed? He couldn't stomach that. Or let's say they needed to do a little bit of invasion. They talked about the southern island called Kyushu. Let's say they invaded that. That'd be 31,000 American soldiers they predicted to die to invade the southernmost island. You notice I put down 1 million? Truman after the war would say 1 million Americans would have died if we would have invaded. So I saved their lives. He was never told that. What was he doing? Yeah, he was exaggerating, AKA lying, to justify dropping 2 atomic bombs. But 31,000 is a lot. So let's be clear about that. And we're not even talking about how many hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Japanese would have died. Yes.
Well, because they entire Japanese countries.
Well, they knew if they'd been at Kaiyuja, that'd probably be enough. Because they'd have air bases, they would have complete air superiority. But even that would be unbelievable.
And one of the invasion fleet has to be larger.
Oh yeah, Okinawa was larger than D-Day. The total number of ships, because we had aircraft carriers, we didn't need the aircraft carriers. And then we just spent $2 billion on this secret program to build an atomic bomb. This massive program that had, they did the centrifuges for the uranium in Tennessee. Remember the TVA? They need electricity. They did the chain reaction to create plutonium, which is a man-made, highly radioactive mineral. They did that in Washington. Why? Grand Coulee Dam, electricity. Don't swim in the water. If you go to the Tri-Cities, don't swim. Trust. No, it's really three-headed fish.
So when did you say that in Manhattan, Chapter?
If we spent that much money to use it, can you imagine justifying that? And there's something else. Why not use every weapon we have? Why not use the atomic bomb? I mean, think about the generals, Hap Arnold, the head of the Air Force, thinking, we have killed thousands of civilians. We're killing them every night. What's the difference between firebombing and an atomic bomb? Well, there is a difference. But the thinking in July is really, we have no qualms about bombing and killing civilians by then. We're killing them by the thousands. Why wouldn't we use it? And so, that was the order Truman gave. Truman never ordered the use of the atomic bomb. Truman never did like, okay, carefully thought out, we'll drop. No, Truman never did anything like that. All Truman did is he informed the Joint Chiefs of Staff that you can use whatever weapons are necessary to win the war. After the war, Truman would imply and then say, I made the order. It was me. Partially to take credit for winning the war, but also the Americans like the idea that only one person can order the use of atomic bombs. Not anybody can do it. So there's a myth today that only the president can do that. Use any weapons, just use whatever weapons you want to war.
What department?
The Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Okay.
Basically the commander of the Army, the Air Force.
Yeah.
The Air Force was still part of the Army back then.
So who can authorize an atomic bomb now in the Air Force?
It's most of that secret, but generals can do it.
Like any general?
No, certain ones.
Okay.
But that stuff, that is top secret. But we just know they can do it.
And they usually. And it's not like a big red button.
They call it the football that the president carries, but it's codes. But they call it the football. So if you ever see the president and there's an Air Force officer with a briefcase, that's the football. So wherever President Trump goes. And he can order anytime he wants. So, and lastly, dealing with a beast. Look how the Japanese fought. Look how the Japanese fought on all these islands. Look what they did to American POWs. What were the suicide bombers? What were the suicide bombers called? Yeah. And then racial. Can you deal with that race? It was such a horrible racial conflict. Look what they did. If we do have to fight them, it'll fight to the finish, and they don't deserve terms. These are all thinking going into that July. How do we end the war? That's why when we had all the weapons necessary, we made 3 atomic bombs. They tested 1, Trinity, so we have 2. How many do we use?
2.
Why did we use 2?
Because we could, why not?
2 reasons. First off, because we had 2.
Well,
But also, if we use 2, what does that imply?
you have more.
You have more. We wouldn't have another bomb for 6 months. but in implied, we have a lot more. Does that make sense? So with that, there's one more big issue. The Soviets. And these are things we already talked about, so I just put them down again. We feared communists forever. We intervened there. Yalta, Eastern Europe. Would they want an occupation zone in Japan? And that's where you get Truman saying, we want Stalin to play ball after the war. We're going to have to show we're tough. All these were part of the decision making. So you can write it down again, but these are all things we just talked about. That's why I didn't go through them. By the way, that's at Yalta. I think that's a really good picture. And Stalin liked American cigarettes. I think Marlboro, but I can't remember exactly. Which is kind of, it's fun. Lung cancer, no. That's Attlee right there. That's Admiral King. So these are all things we talked about. So, just to repeat, but I put them up there. So all these things, which is the most important of these decisions? Why decide we got to use?
So
It's not cut and dry, though, is it? And by the way, are any of these decisions I just showed you that somewhere, are they military?
No.
They're all political. War is always political. And one more thing, what do you call political discourse between two countries? What do you call that? You know the word. When I say it, you're going to get, oh yeah, maybe you said it. Diplomacy. Right? That's politics between two countries. Did anyone say it and I didn't hear it? You could have said it after like I was, oh, good job, because I didn't hear it. So, August 6th would be Hiroshima, August 9th, Nagasaki. But we're going to watch a little bit of Trinity, the atomic bomb movie. Just a few scenes.
What about yours?
Huh?
What about your YouTube? Just copyrighted.
So this is a side of the first one. It's great. They use all this classical music. It's well done. It goes through all the American atomic tests. It goes through all of them. And it uses high definition film so you can see it. This movie is fantastic. A couple years ago, I did a unit special conference about the Cold War atomic bomb. We watched it. Classic. You got me. New Mexico. Los Alamos, where they built the bomb. That's in New Mexico because it's pretty isolated. Alamogordo is 10,000 feet up this high plateau. Not many people live there, so they can clear it out. Yeah, Los Alamos. If you ever get a chance, Los Alamos, New Mexico is really cool. Not that they still do it.
The hot New Mexico desert seemed far
But
from
it's
the
one of the best
ravages of
museums I've
war.
ever been to about the bomb. So what they're doing here is, it's not as loud as I wanted. What'd you do to my sound?
100 tons of TNT. A rehearsal to scale and
No. So they don't know how big the bomb's going to be, so they
2
want
months
something to
from this day,
measure it against.
man would unleash the destructive power of a demon locked within the very fabric of matter and plunge the world into the atomic age.
I love this scene right here. So they're hitting this explosives, and he hits the hammer, and it's 100 tons.
For the next 20 years, testing the power of the atomic
Why?